Let's go back to London, the 18th of April, 1638. A young man is brought out through the gate of the Fleet prison. His hands are tied to the back of an ox cart. He is stripped to the waist. The cart begins to move west, and as it moves, an officer walks behind it with a whip of 3 knotted cords and lays it across the young man's bare back. The distance from the Fleet to the New Palace Yard at Westminster is about 2 miles. The whip works the whole way. A crowd follows. It is a spectacle, and London has developed a taste for this particular spectacle because the king's courts have been busy in these years and the punishments are public by design. The point of the ceremony is not only to hurt the man. The point is to show a city what happens to a man who will not submit. At Westminster, the cart stops and the young man is put into the pillory, head and hands locked in the wood, body bent forward, unable to move or to shield himself. And there, bleeding, he begins to talk. He tells the crowd that he has broken no law of the land. He tells them that the court that sentenced him had no lawful power to do what it did to him. He goes on talking until the officers force a gag into his mouth and tighten it. Even then, he is not finished. He has pamphlets in his pockets, and he pulls them out and throws them into the crowd, and the crowd takes them. What had he done? He had carried unlicensed Puritan books into England from Holland and helped to see them printed and passed around. For that, he had been arrested in December of 1637 and brought before the Court of Star Chamber, the King's prerogative court, the great engine of Stuart censorship. And in that court, something happened that mattered more than the books. He was not charged. He was asked to swear an oath, the ex officio oath, binding him to answer truthfully whatever questions the court chose to put to him, including questions designed to draw a confession out of his own mouth. That was how the court worked. That was how it had always worked. He refused to take the oath. He said the oath was against the law of God and against the law of the land, and that no man was bound to accuse himself. He would not swear. He would not answer. He would not, whatever they did to him, be made the instrument of his own conviction. On the 13th of February, 1638, Star Chamber sentenced him to a fine of £500, to be whipped, to be pilloried, and to be held in prison until he obeyed. He was 23 years old. He had been convicted of no crime. His offense was refusing to answer a question. His name was John Lilburne, and the crowd that carried his pamphlets home from New Palace Yard would come to call him Freeborn John. Within 10 years, he and men like him would be doing something that no whipping could have prevented and that the court which sentenced him could not have imagined. They would be arguing in print and in petitions and finally in a county church full of armed soldiers that the authority of every government in England, court, parliament, and crown alike, rested on nothing more and nothing less than the consent of the people who lived under it. Coke had defended English liberty by showing that it was old. These men were about to defend it by arguing that it was true. I am Jeff Gellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 9 of the series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. And today, The Levelers. This episode corresponds to Article 9 of our written series, published this past Sunday on our Substack page. The article traces the movement from its origins in the collapse of censorship to its destruction in a Cotswold churchyard. The podcast expands on those themes, provides additional primary sources, and addresses complexities the written format cannot fully explore. This is going to be a good one. So let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions Podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
The whipping of John Lilburne took place in the middle of a decade of personal rule. Charles I had inherited from his father the conviction that a king answered to God alone, and through the 1630s he governed without calling a parliament at all, raising money by expedients that his opponents held to be unlawful and enforcing religious conformity through the courts that answered to him. The quarrel that the last episode traced through Coke, whether the king's power ran only as far as the law allowed, or whether the crown held reserves of authority above the reach of Parliament and the courts, had not been settled by argument. It had merely been postponed. In 1640, out of money and out of options, Charles called Parliament back. Within 2 years, the postponement ended, and the kingdom was at war with itself. Parliament won that war, and it won it largely because in 1645 it built a new kind of army. The new model army was professional, paid on a national establishment rather than raised by county levy, and promoted for competence rather than for birth. It was also saturated with the radical religion of the age. Independents, Baptists, and sectaries of every description, men who read Scripture for themselves and drew on their own conclusions about hierarchy, authority, and the standing of a soul before God. An army of men convinced that no bishop and no king stood between themselves and their Maker turned out to be an army very difficult to send quietly back to the plow. 2 collapses opened the ground beneath the whole conflict. The first was the collapse of censorship. The machinery that had licensed and controlled printing in England, the Stationers' Company, the bishops, Star Chamber itself, broke apart in the early 1640s, and through the gap came a flood of cheap print, pamphlets, petitions, broadsides, printed sermons, and printed answers to sermons, arguments and counter-arguments, sold in the street for a few pence, read aloud in taverns and barracks to men who could not read them for themselves. We know the scale of that flood with unusual precision because a London bookseller named George Thomason set out to save a copy of everything. Between 1640 and 1661, he collected more than 22,000 items and had them bound in the order he acquired them into some 2,000 volumes. They sit today in the British Library. That is what the collapse of licensing looked like when you stacked it on a shelf. 22,000 pieces of paper, most of them arguing with each other, in a country of perhaps 5 million people. The second collapse was the collapse of the settled authority itself. When a nation stops arguing about whether the king may tax without consent and starts shooting about it, when the old machinery stops working and men must decide by force what will replace it, questions that had seemed permanently closed start to crack open. If the king could be resisted, what could not be questioned? If authority rested on consent, then whose consent, and measured how, and what was owed to a government that had never asked? Out of that opening came the movement that its enemies named the Levelers. The name itself was an insult. It implied that these men meant to level all distinctions of rank and property, to pull down the estates of the great and divide them among the poor. They denied it repeatedly and emphatically in print, and the denial was not a dodge. The protection of a man's property against seizure was near the center of what they wanted. But the name stuck anyway, as insults often do. They were not a party in any modern sense. They had no whip, no treasury, and no settled membership. They were a loose network of London radicals, printers, pamphleteers, and their allies among the soldiers, bound together by conviction of consent, law, and the standing of an individual against arbitrary power. What they had instead of an organization was a press and a method. They wrote, they petitioned, they gathered signatures by the thousand and carried them to Westminster in processions. Their supporters wore sea green ribbons so that a man could see walking down a London street how many others there were. It was public on purpose. It was overt demonstration of how popular the movement had become. 3 men gave that movement its intellectual center, and each of them pressed a different edge of the same argument. Let us first start with the man from the pillory. John Lilburne's supporters called him Freeborn John, and the nickname came from the phrase he had made his own, the right of the freeborn Englishman. That word carries his entire argument in a single term. Certain rights belonged to a man because he had been born free in England. They were his birthright. They were not the gift of a king or a court or a parliament, and therefore no king, no court, no parliament could lawfully take them away. The principle he had stood on in Star Chamber, that a man cannot be compelled to become the instrument of his own conviction, was not settled law in 1637. There was no Fifth Amendment that we know today. Rather, it was a contested claim, and the court that gagged him plainly did not accept it. His resistance helped to settle it. Star Chamber was abolished by Parliament in 1641, and Lilburn, more than any other single figure, turned the right against self-accusation from a claim a prisoner shouted into a piece of the common law inheritance. We will follow that particular thread across the Atlantic later in this hour. Because of everything the levelers touched, it has clearly the most documented afterlife. But doctrine is not what made Lilburn the movement's public face. What made him its public face was his genius for turning his own persecution into a public argument. Authority moved against him under the king, then it moved against him under Parliament, which imprisoned him in the Tower. Then it moved against him under Cromwell, which tried him for his life. Every single time, Lilburn made the proceeding itself the trial of English liberty. He demanded to be told the charge. He demanded to see the indictment, to confront his accusers, to have the benefit of the law he insisted applied to every freeborn Englishman and therefore to him. In his treason trial in 1649, standing alone against the power of the new republic, he turned the jury into his audience and the courtroom into a stage, and the jury acquitted him. According to the contemporary accounts collected in the state trials, the cheering that followed the verdict was so loud and so long that the court could not restore order for something like half an hour. A medal was struck to commemorate it. He was also impossible. A hostile contemporary said of him that if there were none left alive but Lilburn, then Lilburn would quarrel with John and John with Lilburn. He was vain. He was litigious past all reason. He quarreled with nearly every ally he ever had, and he could not tell the difference between a great constitutional principle and a personal grievance, because he pursued both with exactly the same inexhaustible fury. Those qualities were not incidental to what he accomplished. They were the engine of it. Lilburn was the most effective one-man demonstration in his century of what it looks like when an ordinary subject refuses to let a government off the hook of its own law. If Lilburn supplied the drama, Richard Overton supplied the deepest idea. Overton was a printer, a satirist, and a religious radical, and he was very good at making enemies laugh at powerful men. In 1646, the House of Lords put him in Newgate prison. From Newgate, he wrote the pamphlet that carries the leveler argument down to its philosophical root, and he gave it a title worthy of the pamphlet wars of that century. An Arrow Against All Tyrants and Tyranny, shot, as the full title has it, from the prison of Newgate into the prerogative bowels of the arbitrary House of Lords. Listen to how it opens. He states it the way a man states something he considers obvious. To every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For everyone as he is himself, so he has a self-propriety, else he could not be himself. And a few lines on, no man has any power over my rights and liberties, and I over no man's. That is a printer writing in a cell in 1646. The claim is worth unfolding because it does an enormous amount of work in very few words. Overton is saying that each person owns himself. Self-propriety, a property in one's own person, is the root of fact from which every other right grows. No one may invade it without violating the most basic principle of justice between one human being and another. And from that root, he derives the rest. That all men are born equally to liberty, that legitimate authority can arise only from the consent of those who own themselves. And that power exercised over a man without his consent is usurpation, no matter how ancient the usurper or how splendid his title. Be careful about what Overton was and was not doing. He was arguing in the theological and natural law vocabulary available to a radical Protestant in 1646 that God and nature had made each person the proprietor of himself, and that this fact set a limit no earthly power could rightly cross. He was not writing a modern treatise on property rights, and it would be an error to read back into a pamphlet the fully worked out systems that later thinkers built similar ground upon. What can be said is more interesting for being bounded. Overton put into forceful English and pushed to radical conclusion the proposition that the individual person is the basic unit of right and the origin of legitimate authority. The proposition had a long life ahead of it. When later generations argued that government exists to secure rights that the individual already holds and derives its just powers from consent, they were developing something Overton had already started with unusual clarity in his own idiom and for his own moment. The resemblance is real, but it is resemblance and not a direct wire. As a quick aside, some of you listening may be thinking to yourself, somewhat comically, that Overton had actually shifted the Overton window. And just as an aside for political science nerds out there like me, it is just a similarity in the name. The Overton window was named for Joseph Overton in the 1990s, a political scientist, not Richard Overton of the 1640s. Just as a coincidental aside. Now, the third of the movement's central minds was the least theatrical and in some ways the one who reached the furthest. William Walwyn was a merchant. He was widely read, and he was calm where Lilburn was combustible. His radicalism ran not toward self-dramatization, but toward a settled and genuinely unusual tolerance. In an age that argued endlessly about which religion the state ought to compel, Walwyn argued that the state should compel none. A person's belief, he held, were answerable to God and not to the magistrate. Liberty of conscience was a right and not a concession. And the long English habit of enforcing religious uniformity by law had produced, on the evidence of the century everyone had just lived through, not godliness, but cruelty, hypocrisy, and endless strife. He pushed that tolerance further than most of his own allies were prepared to go, extending his concern to the people his age was quickest to despise, and grounding it not only in Scripture, but in plain compassion that reads across 4 centuries as strikingly modern. He was equally insistent on the equality before the law, that the same rules must bind the great and the humble alike, with none of the exemptions and privileges that rank had always claimed as a matter of course. In a society that took hierarchy to be the settled order of creation, the proposition that a law must apply identically to a lord and to a laborer was not a modest reform. It was a quiet revolution in what law was for. Walwyn also pressed his friends where they were weakest. When Lilburn wrapped his claims in Magna Carta and the ancient rights of freeborn Englishmen, Walwyn was capable of telling him in print that a charter wrung out of a king centuries ago was a beggarly thing to wrest a free people's liberties on. If the rights were real, they did not need a parchment from 1215 to make them real. Toleration, self-ownership, the rights of the freeborn. 3 men, 3 edges of a single argument. That authority is legitimate only by the consent of those it governs, and that certain rights stand as walls the government may not cross, whatever its majorities, whatever its traditions. What the levelers did next was try to write that argument down as law. To understand what happened at Putney, you first have to understand how an army came to have a council that common soldiers sat in. The First War ended in 1646, and Parliament immediately faced the problem that every victorious government faces. It had an army it no longer needed and could not afford. The new model was owed enormous arrears of pay. Parliament proposed to disband most of it without settling those back payments and to ship a good part of the rest to Ireland, with pay available only to the men who agreed to go. It also declined to guarantee that soldiers would be shielded from prosecution for things done under the orders during war. In the spring of 1647, the regiments answered that by electing representatives, 2 men from each regiment, chosen by the soldiers themselves. They were called agitators, which at that time carried no odor of disorder. It simply meant agents, men authorized to act for others. Then, in the first days of June, an agitator named Cornet George Joyce rode with 500 troopers to Holdenby House in Northamptonshire and took custody of the King of England out of the hands of Parliament's commissioners. He did it on the initiative of the agitators, not by order of the generals, and the generals accepted it afterwards as an accomplished fact. Days later, on Kenford Heath near Newmarket, the army adopted the Solemn Engagement. In it, the officers and soldiers covenanted with one another not to disband until their grievances were settled. And this is the part that matters for our purposes. They established a general council of the army, composed of senior officers together with 2 commissioned officers and 2 private soldiers elected in every regiment. They unionized. Consider what had just been constituted. An army force with an English state had given itself a deliberate body in which a trooper sat with a vote alongside the commissioned general. Nobody had planned it as a constitutional experiment. It arose out of a fight about back pay. But there it was. And over that summer, the Army senior officers, the men known as the grandees, kept negotiating with the captive king. The radicals in the ranks watched those negotiations with mounted disgust and concluded that the men who had led them to victory were preparing to hand the settlement back to the very authority they had beaten. In October, 5 of the most radical cavalry regiments elected new agents to replace the ones they no longer trusted, and those new agents issued a manifesto called "The Case of Army Truly Stated." It accused the grandees of betraying the soldiers and the people, and it demanded a settlement founded on the authority of the people rather than on a bargain with the king. And alongside it, on the table at the same moment, lay a shorter and far more remarkable document. It was called An Agreement of the People, and it attempted something with almost no precedent in England itself, to set down in one written instrument a national frame of government together with the rights the government could not touch, and to derive the whole of it from the direct consent of the people rather than from custom, from conquest, or from royal grant. A quick word about where it came from. The first agreement is easy to describe and is often described as Lilburne's manifesto handed to the army. But recent scholarship treats that as too simple. The text emerged out of the politicized New Model itself and its civilian radical allies together. And the question of exactly who drafted it remains genuinely open. It was a joint product of the barracks and of the print shop, which is precisely what made it dangerous. To see why the document was extraordinary, recall what the last episode established about the Constitution these men had inherited. England's Constitution was unwritten. It was a vast, accumulated body of common law, custom, statute, and precedent, understood by Coke in his profession as immemorial, reaching back beyond record into a Saxon past. Its authority came from age. Its contents were known to the trained lawyer who could say what ancient custom required. The agreement proposed something different in kind. It proposed to place the foundation of government not in the depths of the past, but in a present and deliberate act of consent. A document the people themselves would subscribe, fixing what the government could do and reserving what it could never do. The reserve rights are the heart of it. The agreement granted the people's representatives a wide authority to make and unmake law, and then carved out of that authority a set of matters the people had never handed over and never would. The formula is in Article 4. The power of the representatives extends, the document says, to whatsoever is not expressly or implied reservedly by the representative to themselves. Read that structure carefully. Everything not reserved is granted, and what is reserved is withheld absolutely, placed beyond the reach of any parliamentary majority whatsoever. If anybody knows their U.S. Constitution out there, that sounds a lot like the Ninth Amendment to me. Then the document names them. Matters of religion and the ways of God's worship are, in its words, not at all entrusted by us to any human power. No man is to be forced by impressment to fight in the wars, or write the agreement grounds in conscience. No man is to be called to account once the fighting is over for what he did in the public quarrels of the late conflict. And in all laws made or to be made, every person may be bound alike, no rank, no estate, no charter, and no birth conferring exemption from the ordinary course of law. These things, the agreement concludes, we declare to be our native rights, held already and merely declared. A written instrument deriving its authority from popular consent, a government of granted and limited powers, a set of rights reserved to the people and placed above the ordinary legislature so that no majority may vote them away. There were several versions of the agreement, the armies of 1647 and further versions in 1649, including one that Lilburn, Walwyn, Prince, and Overton drafted together while imprisoned in the Tower. They differ in their particulars, but the design holds across all of them. Now, the temptation here is to say more than the evidence will carry. So let us be exact about the claim. The agreement of the people was not the first written political covenant anywhere in the English-speaking world. Englishmen across the Atlantic had already been at this. The Mayflower Compact of 1620, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. What the agreement attempted was to do it for the English nation itself. To found the government of an old kingdom of 5 million people on a written constitution derived from popular consent and bounded by reserved rights. To call it simply the first written constitution full stop, or to draw a clean line from its clauses to Philadelphia, would be to trade a defensible claim for an impressive one. What is defensible is impressive enough. Ordinary Englishmen in the wreckage of a civil war reasoned their way to the form a free constitution would eventually take, and they wrote it down more than a century before that form became familiar. They did not, however, agree among themselves about who the consenting people included. The disagreement is what drove them into that church at Putney. Now let's go back again. It is the 29th of October, 1647, in the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin, in the riverside village of Putney, a few miles upstream from Westminster. The General Council of the Army has gathered to argue about the future of England. Officers and elected soldier representatives sit together, common troopers in council with their generals, which in itself is one of the more extraordinary sights of the century. Fairfax is absent. Oliver Cromwell is in the chair. We know what was said in that church because a young man named William Clark, Secretary of the Army's High Command, took the debate down in shorthand and afterward transcribed it. Now, we must hold that record for what it is. It is incomplete. It is the fullest for only a few of the days. It was set down in the heat of a live and overlapping argument by one man and written out later. We cannot reconstruct the room from it, who stood where, how the voices rose, what the faces did when a thing was said. But what survives is the language. And the language is enough. The pivotal exchange came over a single proposition buried in the longer document before the council, that representation in Parliament ought to be apportioned according to the number of the inhabitants. Read one way, that is a technical matter of redistricting. Read another way, it implied something that no major kingdom or national parliament in Europe then practiced. That every man, or something close to every man, should have a voice in choosing the men who made the laws he lived under. Colonel Thomas Rainsborough rose to defend the radical reading and gave it the words that have outlived everything else spoken in that church. For really, I think that the poorest he, that is England, hath a life to live, as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it is clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. Henry Ireton answered him. Ireton was Cromwell's son-in-law, a formidable lawyer, soldier, and the sharpest mind among the grandees. He did not dispute that all men were born under some claim to natural liberty, and that is worth registering, because it tells you how far the ground had already moved. He disputed something else. Who had a stake permanent enough to be trusted with a share in disposing of the kingdom's affairs? No person had a right to a voice in choosing the makers of the law, Ireton replied, who did not have a permanent fixed interest in this kingdom. A real and lasting stake, meaning in practice a freehold or some other settled interest, whether in land and corporate standing or in a recognized trading concern that bound a man permanently to the realm. His warning was concrete and on its premises entirely coherent. Extend the vote to every man who breathes English air, and you have cut the vote loose from any stake in the country. Men with nothing will vote to take from men with something. A franchise cut loose from the property will, in the end, abolish property itself. Rainsborough's answer to that was the one that the levelers kept returning to. If a man may be bound by a law, hanged under a law, taxed under a law, and sent to die in a war declared under a law, then he has a stake in that law, whether or not he owns an acre. His life is his stake. There, compressed into an afternoon's argument between two soldiers in a requisition church, is a question the modern world has never once stopped asking. Does a person's title to a voice in his own government come from what he owns or what he is? Rainsborough grounded it in the man. Ireton granted it in the stake. Neither of them invented the question, but the men in the church pressed it harder and staked more on the answer than almost anyone in the English-speaking world had done before. The debates ran into November. A committee was appointed to reconcile the agreement with the officers' own proposals, which is what happens to radical documents in committees. Cromwell and Ireton worked steadily to blunt the edges. Then the king escaped from Hampton Court. The council was overtaken by the emergency. The soldiers' representatives were eventually removed from it altogether, and the Second War came. The argument at Putney was never resolved. It was adjourned by events, and then it was closed by force. To restate, and the argument still happens today, who has the right to vote? The documented, the landholders, the people with a stake in the outcome of what is taxed, how business gets done, what holdings remain, who are permanently tied to the nation, or everybody who is under the law, who has themselves as the stake, their persons as the stake, for they have to pay taxes, for they are required to go to war when it is declared by the nation. These questions happen today in every single nation, including our own, under different terms. An account of these men that leaves out the gap between what they said and what they proposed is not an account worth having. Begin with the gap because it opens at the movement's most quoted moment. Rainsborough's poorest he rings across 4 centuries as though it announced universal suffrage. One man, one vote, the whole democratic future in a single sentence. It did not. And the levelers themselves did not propose that it should. When they set down the actual terms of the franchise they wanted, most of them stopped well short of every man. The various levelers' proposals generally excluded servants and excluded those who took alms. They generally excluded, or at least argued about, men who lived on wages paid by another. The reasoning was one they shared with Ireton rather than the poorest he rhetoric suggests. A man dependent on another man's will could not cast a free and independent voice, and to enfranchise him was in practice to hand a second vote to his master. Whether the wage laborer was in or out shifted from draft to draft and from debate to debate, and the scholarship on exactly how far the proposed franchise reached remains genuinely divided. So to put that in common terms, the debate about whether or not somebody that was on welfare, somebody that was receiving assistance, were they entitled to a vote? Or if they were in the employ of a master, a servant, were they just not echoing the vote of the master and thereby giving that person more than one vote? And of course, women were not part of the proposed electorate at all. The political nation these men imagined was a nation of men. So the movement that produced the century's most stirring sentence about the poorest man's equal stake proposed, when they came to a ballot, to leave a great many of the poor outside the door. State that plainly, but then measure it against its age rather than against ours. Even the bounded franchise the Levelers proposed was radical past the point of danger in 1647. It was a vast expansion beyond the propertied silver of Englishmen who actually voted, and it terrified the grandees precisely because it went so far. By the standard of their century, these men were extraordinarily inclusive. By the standard of the sentence everyone remembers, they were not as inclusive as the sentence sounds. Both those statements are true. The reach of the words outran the reach of the proposals, and the proposals were still radical enough to make their supporters enemies of the men who commanded the army. There is a further piece of that deserves its own moment. In the spring of 1649, with the leaders of the movement locked in the Tower, Leveler women organized. They gathered signatures and they carried a petition to the House of Commons, not once, but on successive days, returning after they were turned away. Bulstrode Whitelock, who was there, recorded that several hundred women attended the House on behalf of Lilburn and the rest. Parliament's answer on the 25th of April was that the matter they petitioned about was of higher concernment than they understood, that the House had already given an answer to their husbands, and that they were therefore desired to go home and to look after their own business and meddle with their housewifery. In other words, go home and do the dishes. They came back in May with a petition that answered it directly. Since we are assured, they wrote, of our creation in the image of God, and of an interest in Christ equal unto men, and also of a proportionate share in the freedoms of this commonwealth, since that is so, they asked, how have we come to appear so despicable in your eyes as to be thought unworthy to petition this House at all? Hold those two facts together, because both belong in this account. The Leveler franchise did not include those women. And those women took the movement's own premises, equal creation, an equal interest, a proportional share, and turned them on to Parliament that had just executed a king in the name of the people. The logic in the words was already running ahead of the men who had wrote them. Then there are the men themselves. Lilburne's vanity and litigiousness were not incidental blemishes on an otherwise serene public servant. They were woven into everything he did. He quarreled with nearly every ally he ever had. He could not distinguish a great constitutional principle from a personal grievance, and he pursued both with the same fury, which meant that the movement's most famous champion was also a chronic source of its divisions. And Overton's gift for savage satire made enemies the cause could not always afford. And none of them built anything that lasted. The Levelers never constructed a durable organization. They never resolved their own disagreements about how far the franchise should reach, and they never commanded the disciplined loyalty that might have let them hold the ground they briefly seized. They were pamphleteers and agitators of genius, and they were not, in the end, builders of institutions. The fair judgment is the harder one, and it holds two things at once without letting either erase the other. These were flawed men who did not fully live up to their own most expansive language, working in a movement that never cohered into lasting power and was destroyed within 2 years of its peak. And they articulated more clearly than anyone in their world had yet managed principles that outlasted every one of their failures, that government rests on consent, and that the individual owns himself, that rights can be written down and placed beyond the reach of power, that the law must bind all alike. The principles outran the men and outran the limits of what the men proposed. That is not a reason to gild the men. It is a reason to take the principles seriously on their own terms, which is exactly what the men themselves ask their readers to do. Now, against the account I had just given, a serious reader can raise at least 3 objections, and each one, as always, will be given at full strength. Number 1, the Levelers lost, and they lost completely. Within 2 years of Putney, their leaders were in prison or broken, their soldier allies were shot or scattered, and the movement was finished as a political force. They did not win the franchise they wanted. Their agreement was never adopted. The republic they had helped bring into being turned on them and destroyed them. And then the republic gave way to a military dictatorship under Cromwell, and after him, to the return of the very monarchy that they had fought. Measured by its results in their own time, the Levelers accomplished nothing that lasted. Their supposed importance, the objection runs, is a thing read back into them by later admirers who wanted distinguished ancestors. It is a retrospective construction laid over a total and unambiguous defeat. The facts in that objection are almost entirely correct, and they should be conceded without softening. The Levelers were beaten as thoroughly as a political movement can be beaten. What that objection assumes, and what does not follow, is that the movement's defeat in its own moment settles the worth or the reach of its ideas. Ideas that lose can survive their defeat in print, be read by people their authors never imagined, and win arguments generations later that their first champions lost. The Leveler pamphlets did not vanish when the movement did. George Thomason had already bound them into his volumes. They were preserved, collected, and eventually read again. Whether they in fact traveled far enough to matter is a fair question, and it is precisely the next objection. But the bare fact of defeat does not answer it. Defeat and irrelevance are not the same thing. Now, the second objection, the objection that the American line is thin and was reconstructed after the fact. This objection grants that the idea survived on paper and strikes at the claim that they went anywhere. The founders did not cite Lilburn. The agreement of the people was not a text they studied, and most of them had very likely never read it. By the 18th century, the Levelers were a half-forgotten episode, remembered when remembered at all, as a byword for the chaos of the interregnum. To claim them as ancestors of the American written constitutionalism is to build a lineage after the fact, to connect 2 endpoints by resemblance, and then call the resemblance descent. Similar ideas appearing a century apart do not prove that the earlier caused the latter. The parallels may be convergence, 2 sets of people responding to related problems and arriving at related answers. This is the objection to respect most because it names a real discipline. So the reply has to observe that discipline rather than evade it. And that means keeping 2 very different kinds of claim apart. The first kind is a claim of documented, traceable influence, and it should be made only where the documents support it. There is at least one such channel here, and it is very well attested. John Lilburne stand against being made to testify against himself. His refusal to the Star Chamber's oath, his insistence that no freeborn man is bound to accuse himself, entered into the common law tradition as one major foundation of right against self-incrimination. That right crossed the ocean and was written into the Fifth Amendment. That is not a resemblance somebody noticed later. It is a line legal history traces directly. When the Supreme Court of the United States set out the modern law of that right in Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, the court's opinion reached back through the history of privilege to the 17th century English struggle in which Lilburne was a central figure. Justice Hugo Black regarded the Leveler fight as part of the foundation of the protections the Bill of Rights secures. Where a channel like that can be documented, the influence is real, and it should be claimed without apology. The second kind of claim is looser, and it has to be labeled as what it is: the broad architecture of the agreement. A written constitution granted and limited powers, rights reserved to the people above ordinary legislature, reappears in American constitutionalism. But that reappearance cannot be traced through a clean chain of citation from Leveler pamphlet to the founding document. The honest description is that the levelers were among the first to articulate a form that the American founders, drawing on many sources and their own long colonial experience, would later give enduring shape. They are better understood as early travelers on a road that others would map than as the direct author to the destination. That is a bounded claim. It is the one that evidence will bear. Kept inside its bounds, it is still a significant one. To be among the first to reason your way to a form the future will need is no small thing, even when the future does not remember your name. The third objection: they were not Democrats, so the praise is anachronistic. The third objection turns on the words we use. To call the levelers Democrats, champions of popular sovereignty and the rights of the common man, is to dress 17th century radicals in 18th and 19th century clothing. Their actual franchise, as the reckoning conceded, excluded servants, excluding those taking welfare, the poor in most versions, and excluded women entirely. Their world was one of natural hierarchy, godly commonwealth, and the rights of freeborn Englishmen, a national and historic claim, not a universal one. Reading them as forerunners of modern democracy projects a later ideal backward onto the men who did not hold it and who would not have recognized it. There's real force in that, and the reply is not to deny it, but to be precise about what is being claimed. The levelers were not modern little d Democrats, and I have not called them that. Their franchise was bounded. Their vocabulary was the vocabulary of the century, and to flatten those facts into a tidy origin story for universal subject would repeat exactly the error the last episode named in Coke's admirers, reading a later triumph back into an earlier moment that did not contain it. What can be said and defended is narrower. The levelers pressed the principle of consent further down the social order than nearly anyone in their world. And they stated it in terms: the poorest he, self-propriety, native rights not entrusted to any human power. Terms that were more universal than the bounded proposals they attached to them. The words they chose could be taken up later and applied more broadly than they themselves applied them. That is not the same as calling these men Democrats. It is recognizing that they stated language whose logic ran past what their writers had set, which is one of the ways ideas outgrow the people who first speak them. The movement's end came in a country churchyard, and it is worth us going back to that moment and trying to stand there before we leave these men. It was the spring of 1649. The king was dead, the republic was newly declared, and the unresolved quarrel between the levelers and the grandees came to its crisis. In April, a trooper named Robert Lockyer was shot by a firing squad for his part in a mutiny at Bishopsgate. In May, regiments of the New Model Army, many of them sympathetic to the leveler program, inflamed over the arrears of pay and over orders to ship out for the reconquest of Ireland, mutinied outright and marched north of Salisbury, hoping to gather other discontented regiments as they went. Cromwell and Thomas Fairfax moved out after them with speed, and on the night of the 14th of May, they surprised the main body of Burford in Oxfordshire. Some 340 men were taken. They were locked in the parish church of St. John the Baptist because it was the only building in town large enough to hold them, and they were kept there for 3 days while nothing was said to them about what was going to happen. That was deliberate. Cromwell was breaking the movement's morale, not merely arresting it. During those 3 days, one of the prisoners took something sharp and scratched his name into the lead lining of the font. It's still there. You can go read it. Anthony Sedley, 1649, prisoner. After a brief court-martial, 3 men held to be ringleaders were taken out into the churchyard on the 17th of May and shot against the wall. Cornet James Thompson, Corporal Perkins, and Private John Church. The rest were brought up onto the church roof and made to watch. Then they were pardoned. Within weeks, Cromwell reported to Parliament that the mutiny was suppressed. By late summer, he was in Ireland. That was, for practical purposes, the death of the levelers as a force. The revolutionary movement had opened wide enough to let common soldiers sit in council and debate the foundations of government in a church at Putney. 18 months later, it closed, and it closed with common soldiers shot in a churchyard by the commanders they had followed to victory. The men who had won a war against arbitrary royal power discovered, as revolutionaries so often discover, that the power they had seized was in no hurry to submit itself to the principles they had fought under. Cromwell would rule in the end with a degree of military-backed authority that would have appalled a great many of the men who first took up arms against the Stuarts. Now it is time to apply the liberty test. The Levelers wanted a written constitution that would fix the powers of government and reserve certain matters that no government could touch. A fundamental law that no ordinary majority could alter, however large the majority and however urgent the moment. Did that idea, when it finally took hold in the world, leave people more free or more governed? The case that leaves them more free is the case most of us absorbed young. Majorities are capable of terrible things. A written constitution with reserved rights means that when a majority comes for your conscience, your speech, your property, or your right not to be made to testify against yourself, there is something standing between you and that majority which the majority did not create and cannot simply vote away. The Levelers understood that from the inside, because a parliament that called itself the representative of the people had imprisoned every one of them. The case on the other side is not frivolous, and Ireton would have made it well. A written fundamental law is a set of restraints written by one generation and imposed on every generation after it. The people who subscribe it are dead. The people bound by it never consented to a word of it. And in practice, someone has to say what that document means, which means the reserved rights end up in the keeping of whoever is authorized to interpret them. That is a transfer of power, not a limitation of it. There is a genuine argument into a written constitution that does not remove questions from politics so much as move them to a smaller room. Both of those arguments are serious, and I am not going to pretend the balance is obvious. Here's the question I would put to you, and it is genuinely open. When the people's own elected representatives are told that there are things they may not do, no matter how they vote, is that liberty protected, or is that liberty constrained? And notice that the answer probably depends on which side of the vote you happen to be standing on, which is exactly why the question is worth asking when you are winning rather than only when you are losing. The Levelers asked it while they were losing. They asked in a language that assumed the answer would still matter after they were gone. The words were already loose in the world, and the words in print are hard to kill. The Levelers were crushed. Their movement was broken. Their leader scattered or dead. Their agreement never adopted. Lilburn himself was banished, came back in defiance of the sentence, was tried for his life a second time, was acquitted a second time, and was held in prison anyway. He ended his days as a Quaker and died in 1657 in his early 40s, having spent most of his adult life in the custody of one government or another. By every measure, a general or a magistrate would recognize they lost. But they had said things that could not be unsaid. They had written them where they could be found again. That the poorest man has a life to live as much as the greatest. That every person owns himself, and that no man has power over another man's rights and liberties. That legitimate government rests on the consent of the governed, that a free people may set down their fundamental law in a written instrument and reserve to themselves rights that no majority and no ruler may cross. These propositions did not die at Burford. They waited in pamphlets, in prison-written tracts, for readers who would need them. And they had done something else, which is why this episode sits where it does in the series. Coke defended English liberty by its antiquity. These rights are old, immemorial, inherited, and therefore beyond the king's power to revoke. The Levelers reached back for the inheritance too. Lilburn wrapped his most radical claims in Magna Carta and the rights of the freeborn Englishman, and he never cleanly traded the old idiom for a new one. But they added to it a different and far more dangerous foundation. Not that these rights are ancient, but that they are ours, by nature, given to each person as a self-owning individual, and legitimate only where we have consented. A liberty grounded in antiquity can be lost the moment a better historian proves the history false. A liberty grounded in the nature of the person does not depend on any Saxon past at all. The levelers did not abandon the argument from history. They braided into it an argument from nature and consent that would prove, in the long run, harder to refute and harder to forget. That argument would find its most rigorous statements in the generation that followed. Two men in particular took up the questions the levelers had raised in the barracks and the streets: consent, resistance, and the rights that come before government, and gave them the philosophical form that carried them onto the age of revolutions. One of them would pay for his convictions with his head. The other would write the book the later revolutionary generation, including a young Virginian charged with putting independence into words, would reach for when the time came to justify resistance. Next Saturday, episode 10, The Martyr and the Philosopher, Algernon Sidney and John Locke. And this Tuesday, in our contemporary application episode, we take the leveler idea into the present. Written constitutions and popular sovereignty, the Constitution as a limitation rather than a grant, and what happens to reserved rights under emergency power, and who decides what the document means. We'll also talk about the Fifth Amendment and using it over 100 times in a congressional testimony. This is the road to 1776, and we're still walking it. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 9 of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you will find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and Empire of Liberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes, and follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to parse articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.